Welcome to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton. We observe in Western countries fewer and fewer people attending church, and there seems to be a growing view that maybe God doesn't exist, or at least the God of the Bible, and people are discounting in many ways the Bible, particularly the biblical account of creation, because of the problems with radiometric dating, putting long ages on the earth and so forth. But there is growing evidence that supports not only the historical accuracy of the Bible, but the scientific relevance of things in the Bible. And it's very unfortunate that, in my view, that these aspects of the Bible aren't being taught in our education system, and our government, again, is increasingly, or Western governments, it seems, are increasingly rejecting the values, the Christian values that are contained in the Bible. And one of the interesting aspects of that I've been thinking about and reading recently is the origin of the seventh-day week. Recently, I was challenged to find, what scientific evidence was there for the seven-day week, and I found a very interesting paper titled "7-Day Human Biological Rhythms: An Expedition in Search of Their Origin," that was published in Chronobiology International in 2016. Now, the paper was by an international group of researchers. One of the researchers was from a hospital in Israel. Another two researchers were from biology research units in France, and another one, the senior author, Michael Smolensky, was from the Department of Biomedical Engineering in the Cockrell School of Engineering at the University of Texas in Austin, Texas. And it's fascinating in that what they looked at was they reviewed the accumulating evidence that there is a natural seventh-day cycle in nature. Now, of course, the Bible account in Genesis records how God created the earth in 6 days, the heavens and the earth, stars and everything in 6 days, and rested on the seventh day. And of course, then we have the Ten Commandments that Moses was given by God when the Israelites had left Egypt. They'd been in a pagan society, a society that didn't recognise the Creator God, and God had to sort of re-educate them again. And gave them the Ten Commandments. And, of course, the fourth commandment was to remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. They were to work 6 days and rest on the seventh day. And it was interesting when God was providing food for them, which they had to gather and collect, the manna that fell from heaven. It fell on the 6 days, and on the Friday there was an extra helping fell. And it didn't go off, it kept for over the Sabbath. So there were quite miraculous events that are recorded there that were witnessed by tens of thousands of people and recorded in the Bible, that these miracles occurred, and that's how the people lived during the time that they spent in the desert while they were on their way to where God wanted them to settle, bringing them out of Egypt to the land which became Israel, the land of Israel. So it's interesting, these researchers actually looked at what was the evolutionary evidence for the 7-day cycle. And it's fascinating in that they couldn't find any. But And it's a fascinating paper. And again, you can look it up. Just Google 7-Day Human Biological Rhythms, an expedition in search of their origin. It'll come up. You can download the full paper. A lot of references. The paper is about 30 pages long. But it's interesting in the abstract they say this fact-finding expedition explores the perspectives and knowledge of the origin and functional relevance of the 7-day cycle in the biological time structure, with special reference to human beings. And they also point out that these biological rhythms are displayed in various levels of organisation in diverse species, from unicellular sea algae to plants, insects, fish, birds and mammals, including man, and that these cycles persist under natural as well as artificial, these constant environmental conditions. They also say, nonetheless, very little is known about their derivation. In other words, how did they come to be? And so that's what they were researching. And after looking at the research, they summarise by saying no advantages are apparent for the endogenous, that is internally generated, 7-day rhythms, and that these raise several questions. What is the significance of the 7-day activity rest cycle? In other words, having activity for 6 days and resting on the 7th day, and for these endogenous rhythms. And the only origin that they can find of this social origin was in actual fact the biblical mandate that was given to the Hebrews. So it's the only mandate that was given to humans, and yet it's been adopted worldwide. And so one of the things that they research, why do humans require 1 day off every 7 days? And why do 7-day rhythms bestow functional advantage to organisms? And so it was a really fascinating paper. And they go through, for example, and they list the 7-day cycles. And a lot of study has been done. This research isn't based on just a few research papers. They list so many studies. For example, they talk about and they cite a number of researchers who have studied unicellular organisms. And these organisms, again, they can observe the cycles in. It appears in fossils and so forth as well. And they point out that these algae and so forth, in terms of the evolutionary model, are right at the bottom. And then they again go on to plants, insects, fish, birds, and mammals. As I said, a lot of work done on laboratory rodents, your rats and so forth, and even horses, and of course humans. And they list sort of examples. For example, the water uptake in pole bean seeds display a 7-day bioperiodicity. And then all in insects studied under constant darkness, oviposition, intermoult intervals and growth, for example, in the springtail, and activity level in the beach beetle, and all display these 7-day cycles. Even in honeybees, certain functions of the honeybee or parts of their biochemistry exhibit also 7-day cycles. And for these, there's numerous papers, so it's not just based on a single researcher in this area. A number of researchers have researched these particular 7-day cycles. Other ones they go on for is, for example, the production of certain compounds from the pineal glands in pikefish. And then there's quite a lot of work done on 7-day rhythms in laboratory animals housed in research environments. And what they say is these animals, they have a 24-hour cycle, like the standard circadian rhythm, and that has been well established, and most of us have heard of these, circadian rhythms, our sleep-wake cycles and this sort of thing, which is essentially around 24 hours. Matter of fact, they've done studies where they've isolated people in caves for long periods of time, so they've totally lost track of time, and their natural cycles as a group will initially, some will have shorter cycles, some will have longer cycles, but they will eventually all end up at around a 24-hour cycle. In one study I read, they all synchronised 24.8-hour cycle. So this is your standard circadian rhythm, and what they're saying is that these same rhythms, although they're less perceived, but there are these biochemical rhythms that have these 7-day cycle. And they go on to list quite a few other things. The studies in rats, cardiac, creatine, phosphokinase, enzyme activity, urinary sodium excretion, immune system functions, time course of antibody response to vaccines, and all these sort of things follow this 7-day cycle. There were studies done on semen volume in horses, in human beings, a huge list of 7-day cycle studies on human beings. And they point out there's been a wide variety of studies, although often they haven't involved, huge numbers, thousands of people in a particular study. But nonetheless, there have been a large number of studies of, smaller groups of people, maybe, 40, these sort of numbers. So, for example, they've observed biological oscillations of your 6-day and 1-day cycle, so a total 7-day cycle, in systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, corticosteroid binding activity of human breast milk of lactating mothers, heart rate and body weight gain of neonates, including twins just after birth, nutrient and calorie consumption of 4-year-old infants, detention and enamel deposition of children, so 7-day cycle there. And very importantly, 7-day rhythms of cognitive function reported in school-aged children and adolescents of both genders, and also adult men and women. Quite a lot of studies. I list a whole lot of researchers in that from 1988. Well, the earliest ones, just looking down the list now, from 1967, there seems to be the earliest one, right through to 1998. In adults only, looking at physical activity level, number of researchers there, right up to 2016, looking at all-time nighttime sleep duration, follows the same 7-day cycle, core body temperature, 7-day cycle, cell mitosis, positive and negative moods, functional attributes of the immune and hemostatic system, at least a whole lot there. Researchers going back from the early 80s through to 2007. Total calories and dietary constituent consumption, 2016 research. Stress-associated nighttime eating behaviour, again, 7-day cycle. And that was 2015 research. Urinary sodium excretion, 7-day cycle in plasma, aldosterone and cortisol concentrations of men being studied under long-term spaceflight stimulation. So lots of studies have been reported, and these are endogenous things. In other words, our biochemistry is programmed with this 7-day cycle. And this is quite fascinating. This is really powerful evidence for creation. And one of the reasons why it is powerful evidence for creation, as these authors note is that there have been a lot of studies done to, try and find some sort of cosmic or, sort of electromagnetic field variation or some sort of, clear origin of this. And it's interesting, they say no clear evidence indicates that the concept of the week, 7-day week, as now defined, existed in the Near Eastern and Middle Eastern non-Hebraic populations of the Mediterranean Sea region. In other words, Babylon, Egypt or elsewhere. And they've done quite a bit of historical research on this. It's quite interesting. They talk about the people of Mari residing along the Euphrates River worked non-stop day after day, while some Babylonians observed a 5-day week. And they point out that although the Hebrews used a lunar calendar with 12 months that was recognised and named, they had all sorts of other groupings, but they still had the 7-day week. The 7-day week included the rest day of the Sabbath, was a commandment of God to the Hebrews. And also they point out that it doesn't seem to have been, even though it was given by God, they actually didn't respect it that much until their 70 years of captivity. And so the Babylonian captivity, 586 to 516 BC or thereabouts, 70 years of captivity. I thought it was a little bit before that because I thought Babylon fell 539 BC. But anyway, this is the date in their paper. Then they interpreted that of God's punishment, of course, and they went back to keeping the 6th day, of work and the 7th day of rest. So there was a lot of emphasis by the Jews then to keep the 7-day week themselves. But it's very interesting that the other cultures weren't keeping it at that time. And so this is one of the evidences that the origin of the 7-day cycle came from the Bible. Because, again, in those areas, the people weren't, the other cultures and civilizations around the Jews weren't keeping the 7-day cycles, and the Jews actually became influenced that way, except for those who were religious and honoured serving God and continued to keep the Sabbath. Of course, the Babylonian Empire fell to the Persians about 539, and then the Persian Empire fell to the Greeks, with Alexander the Great, about 331 BC, and then the Greek Empire was gradually taken over by the Roman Empire. But of course, in the early 300s AD, when Constantine had become emperor, he was converted to Christianity, and he promoted the unrestricted practice of Christianity in the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, and promoted then Christian worship. But it's interesting that Constantine in 321 mandated that Sunday must be observed as the weekly day of rest, except for agricultural field workers when seasonally dictated. But actually Sunday was already the weekly pagan day devoted to the sun deity that had been adopted by the Roman Empire as a substitute for the Hebrews' Saturday Sabbath. And it was interesting that the authors of this scientific paper that was published in Chronobiology actually talk all about this in their paper there. So the Sabbath, they point out, is a holy day associated with holiday, meaning of the latter being vacation or vacant, with reference to the Latin root vacuum, meaning empty, no work. So that was in keeping with the Hebrew tradition way of thinking. But of course they then go on, it's quite fascinating, so this is in this scientific research paper, they point out that the Sabbath is far more than a day of rest, since it also includes, when looking backwards, appreciation and satisfaction of one's accomplishments and achievements during the preceding 6 days of work. Thus the Sabbath is a kind of day of thanksgiving for work that was allowed to accomplish on the other non-holy days of the week. and consistent with God's model of the 7-day week, as related in the book of Genesis. During the 24-hour rest of the Sabbath, man should devote no time to being creative, which perhaps explains the forward in time motivation for creativity activity during the ensuing weekdays. So this is actually I'm reading directly from the paper. And so they then go on to comment, however, which I think is quite relevant to today, and quoting from the paper, however, as subsequently discussed, the feelings of accomplishment linked in the past to adherence of the week's holy day in the growing secular society of today increasingly being transformed and monetised. Indeed, for the sceptical and non-believers, both the 24-hour day of rest and the nighttime sleep span have negative connotations of squandering time. From a chronobiological point of view, it's impossible to eliminate the 7-day component from the inherent organisation of processes and functions of the biological time structure. And so what they're essentially saying is that this is part of our intrinsic biochemistry of these 7-day cycles. And they also summarise and point out that it is of significant relevance, and again quoting from their paper to this discussion, is the failure of past attempts to redefine the traditional 7-day week. The leaders of the French Revolution in 1789 rejected the 7-day week, founded on religious doctrine, promoting instead the decimalisation of time, initially in the form of a 10-day week termed a decade. Even highly fit individuals were unable to tolerate the tough, mainly physical, continuous 9-day work span with no interspaced day off. Thereafter, the 5-day week termed the quintidi was promoted, but this too was a disaster and rejected in favour of the traditional 7-day week. So that's a very interesting historical fact. Also, they point out the redefinition of the 7-day week was attempted also by the leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution, who insisted a 5-day week of 1 day, of which was for us to achieve a goal of 20% of the workforce having 1 day off per 5-day period. After an 11-year span from 1929 to 1940 of the dramatically compromised industrial production, Stalin abandoned the 5-day week in favour of the traditional 7-day one. Isn't that fascinating? And it's interesting that what they point out is that scientifically the origin of the 7-day bioperiodic phenomena is unknown. In fact, and they go on to say, in fact, results of studies involving complex organisms, insects and human beings, conducted under constant conditions devoid of the usual 24-hour lunar and annual ambient and social clues, but not necessarily ones of cosmic origin, are not consistent with the contention that these rhythms are generated and maintained or synchronised by cyclic external cosmic electromagnetic or other phenomena. In other words, they're programmed into us. And one of the other fascinating things that they point out in the paper is that the rotation of the Earth around its axis was probably slower in geological times. That would be pre-flood time. And the evidence comes that the year was about 400 days. And that fits because in the Bible, 4 is the number for time, 10 is the number for law and order. And so I did some looking up about that actually, and there is evidence from corals and so forth that the day was slightly shorter then, about 22 hours, and that the year was 400 days. So same total time duration around the Earth. And so it's very important that we can see that the origin of the 7-day cycle is purely from the Bible, but yet it's intrinsically programmed into our biochemistry, the biochemistry of insects, algae, mammals, and plants. It's programmed there, and it really goes back to God saying created for 6 days and then rested on the 7th day. There's no other explanation for this, and yet all the attempts for secular non-religious governments to change this have sort of failed and not be successful. I find this very, very fascinating. And they summarise by saying, from our point of view, the failed experimental attempts by the leaders of the French Revolution to redefine the week as 10 days and then 5 days, as well as leaders of the Russian Revolution to redefine the 5 days, constitute population-based evidence that backs our proposed hypothesis of the biological basis for the 7-day time structure. And they cite a modern example, actually. In 2007, the French Minister for Education, who they describe as a naive political appointee, mandated further reduction in the school week to 4-day, Monday, Tuesday and Thursday, Friday. And they say this misguided mandate, which disregarded the chronobiological and other determinants of the stamina and capability for sustained attention of children, resulted in a consequence that 50% of French school children develop symptoms of intolerance like burnout symptoms, abnormal fatigue, poor attention and sleep disturbances, and additional test scores such as measurative learning dramatically increased. So, even in modern times, people have tried to change. Again, they say we propose the biological requirements for 1 day of rest per 6 day of work derives from one or more chemical substances that progressively accumulate in association with the 6-day work active span as an internal signal perceived by the brain. And this is an endogenous 7-day time structure. So we have this powerful evidence for creation there. And while the 7-day self-sustained oscillator system does not appear to be as strong in terms of amplitude as most circadian and other cyannual rhythms, its biological and clinical significance cannot be dismissed. So it's fascinating evidence for the Bible, for the literal 6-day creation account of us. You've been listening to Faith and Science, and if you want to re-listen to these programs, just Google 3abnaustralia.org.au, click on the radio button and on the Listen and the Faith and Science button. And remember to tell other people about these programs that provide the evidence that we have an amazing Creator God. I'm Dr. John Ashton. Have a great day.
You've been listening to a production of 3ABN Australia Radio.